Hello and welcome to the second meeting of the Autumn Turba online discussion group on the history of alchemy, broadly defined. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Peter Oakley. Peter is lead of the Sustainable Practices in the Anthropocene Research Lab, and as well as a co-lead of the Material Engagements Research Center, cluster rather, at the Royal College of Art in London. He specializes in ethnographics, experiential, and object-based research. Peter's academic expertise covers anthropology, creative practice, science and technology studies, and industrial heritage. His research activities include examining the mining, refining, and assaying of metals and the social and environmental consequences of these activities and associated technologies in the past and present. Peter is currently the UK principal investigator for toxic heritage, natural landscapes in the Heart and Cornwall, a research project funded jointly by the HRC and DFG, so UK and Germany. Before we proceed, the usual administrative matters, to the best extent possible, please keep your video on and the sound off. I will be taking the questions either by if you post them in the chat or you raise your question, your hand virtually. This meeting is broadcast online via the Shack YouTube channel, and you can ask questions there as well. As always, I would like to thank the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom account and YouTube for our use. And at this point, I will give the virtual floor to Peter, who will be talking about extending experimental reconstruction, learning from Chimeric, I hope I pronounced that right, furnaces. Peter told me that the article associated to this came out just 2 days ago on the 5th, so it's very fresh stuff. So Peter, please, if you would like to begin.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Brilliant.
Yes, very
That's
well.
sounding good. Yes, as Joe said, this is very much hot off the press or hot off the griddle, whichever way you feel it. It's part of a special edition about fire management. And Tice, I'm just checking who else is here who may have papers in the special edition, but it covers a number of aspects about fire management in different periods. My paper, I'm not sure if it's an outlier or in the center. You can make your own decisions after reading it, should you spend the time to do it. But I'll be able to give a bit more of a personal take on this. What I'm going to give you is a photo essay, effectively. So for a Friday afternoon, probably, or Friday evening, probably the best way of spending the time. So if I can share my screen. Okay, is that has that now appeared to everybody? The blue, the imminent blue page. So just a quick word about chimeric or chimeric furnaces, whichever way you pronounce your Greek. It's come from one of the workshops that we were doing in terms of the fire arts workshops over the last couple of years. The idea that these furnaces are not actually related in terms of being direct reproductions of another period, but they contain elements of furnaces from different periods, and they give you an opportunity to test and work with elements of a furnace that come from the 16th century, which are contained in elements of a furnace from the 20th century. So that's we've coined the term, and people can tell me I've got it horribly wrong or that it's a beautiful apposite phrase. A quick explanation of why I'm talking about these. This actually goes back to my PhD studies, which was about the circulation of gold. And part of the work that I did during that was to train as a precious metal assayer. This is an image of somebody charging a furnace. So you can just about see inside the furnace there these small dumpy things that look a bit like crucibles, but are actually cupels. They've got very thick walls. They're porous, and what happens is you charge it with a mixture of your sample and lead. The lead turns into litharge. The litharge melts and it draws all of the non-precious metals into the body of the cupel. So this is a picture of the process in action. It takes place around 900 degrees, and what you end up with is this bead of pure precious metal. The process has been refined over centuries. Uh, it was practiced in the 16th, 17th century in a form that you'd recognize today. The image of the assayer standing there charging the furnace with these long tongs, you can see exactly the same sort of images during the gold rush and into the 20th century. But what has changed, both two things. One is about the how the furnaces have changed themselves, but also how perceptions of the practice have changed. So in the 1600s, early 1700s, this is a key aspect relating to alchemy. The Basilius tract, the image on the frontispiece on the right-hand side has Saturn representing lead, or the lead represented through Saturn, and there is a cupel with a charge sitting in a furnace, well, not sitting in a furnace, but sitting in flames, representing the cupellation process as part of the toolkit of the alchemist. But the process is also being used for very economic material purposes. Uh, in Terra Metallica, what you see is a description of assaying used in relation to mining. So this image on the right is a rectangular assay furnace. The assayer again charging it. He's looking rather sanguine and easygoing in comparison to the reality of this process, but there you go. That's the representation. So Derium Metallica is one key source that I've worked with, or particularly Anglophone translations. The other is Erke's treatise, which is specifically about assaying in all its different forms, focusing initially on silver and then moving on to gold, with a very detailed descriptions of the furnace construction and also the processes. So it's a wonderful resource. To flag, one of the things that Erka does uh, is that he gives a review of the development of furnaces prior to the moment of the book being published. And so the furnaces on the top row, A and B, are precursors. These strange pyramids with the top chopped off um, are described as the furnace used by the old assayers, which anybody who's working in mining recognizes. Anybody come before is the old miners or the old assayers. Quite how far back these furnaces go is difficult to tell, but it's certainly a case that you can see a structural development. The the strange sort of coffin-shaped object C is placed under the furnace to enhance the flow of air going through. And then you get these furnaces on the right. The top one is made out of clay. The bottom one is a steel or iron construction, and they integrate these two elements of the furnace. So this is sort of cutting edge technology of the 16th century, and Erker actually promotes this type of furnace by having it in other images, whereas the others you don't see that. But sorry, excuse me a second to get it to move. There we go. So you can get some idea from looking at the imagery about how the furnace is constructed. But of course, you always have this issue. Trying to interpret an image like that can be quite problematic. Fortunately, there is a literary description as well. So matching the two up is quite an exercise in itself. That's one of the things I've been doing. I'm not expecting you to read through this. I just wanted to flag that this is not entirely driven by the illustrations, that it's actually a combination of text and illustration. And here, actually, what you see, this is the frontispiece to the treatise, showing a workshop in full operation, and hiding in the top right-hand corner in the little alcove there, you can see one of the assay furnaces is taking its place. This type of furnace is represented in other texts as well. The Probeerboeken, excuse my pronunciation, uh, later versions have a map of or a technical description of the measurements of the furnace, which is really useful. You can see how similar the furnace in Erker is to these furnaces. And as late as 1721, the Dutch book, and thank you for Thijs for introducing this, has he was the person who flagged this to me. Also has a version of this. So you can see there's a stability of design that seems to be appearing. And I would say what you then find in the 18th century is the furnace starts to mutate into a different form. So this is the specific assay furnace, starts to turn into a more cuboid structure. And then in the 19th century, what you see is furnaces which are entirely cuboid, and things have started moving around in the furnace. I'll talk a bit about that later on at the end, because there's a few surprising things in there. When you use one of these furnaces, you find out that it's not quite everything that it seems. But this is the 1823 edition. And one of the things I spend my life doing is collecting fire assay books. So this is a whole selection from the mid 19th century through to somewhere about, actually the latest ones, the mid 20th century. Again, they're interesting things in their own right. They also demonstrate issues about how knowledge is transferred and the forms that it's constructed in, the way the images are represented. A lot of them use exactly the same photographs. This is obviously a pre-copyright era, because people are obviously ripping off each other's images here. So you see the same images being repeated again and again from previous editions and other authors' work. But they're quite an interesting thing in their own right. I feel a future paper coming on about those. Just to give you an idea of sort of information you get in is, these are permanent brick furnaces that are built, but you get quite technical diagrams which describe the dimensions, how they operate. And this is a wood furnace in which the belly of the furnace, or the muffles, are a long way from the belly of the furnace, because the type of fuel starts becoming very specific to how you heat the furnace. With a wood furnace, you're heating from the end of the flame. With charcoal and coal furnaces, you have to have the fuel round the muffle, this little space in the middle of the furnace, to ensure that you get sufficient heat. So you start finding that the construction of the furnaces shifts in relation to the fuel. And this is sort of near the end of the line of charcoal and coal being used as a material for furnaces. It's made out of cast iron, lined with brick, and you can see that semicircle halfway up. That's the muffle. That's where you'd put your cupel in to charge it, and the ash drops out the bottom, obviously. One of the things I find quite fascinating, this wonderful line in here where it says the interior being smooth and straight from top to bottom. This gone is this idea of having a curved top to the furnace. What you've got is a beautifully smooth profile all the way top to bottom of the furnace. And I've been fortunate enough to see one of the few extant furnaces. This one is very similar to the 1823 Encyclopedia Britannica furnace. It's a physical object and it exists in the Birmingham collections in storage. Um, it's described as a portable furnace. It's got those handles on the side. Um, I've lifted half of this with somebody else, which gives you an idea of how heavy the thing actually is. And yes, it is as heavy as it looks. Um, so the idea, it's sort of taking portable to the edge of what you can think. But this sort of gives an idea about how visceral the process is in relation to the electric furnace, which is a rather abstract entity. You switch the thing on, you leave it. This involves a lot more manual engagement. So with that sort of potpourri of knowledge, whatever the best way of describing it, I started to do a series of test firings, building furnaces that held the principles that came from these texts. And the first version was built in Kent in the UK, in my back garden, I believe it's known as. And actually, some of the things that I did came from a concern of making sure that the furnace was safe. This version is rather over-engineered, but it did work in terms of being able to get to temperature, which was the key thing. I wanted to know that we could get the furnace running up to somewhere near 1,000 degrees Celsius. Um, and it was able to do that relatively easily. It's looking a bit dramatic there because it's having forced air put through it at the moment that I took the photograph in order to demonstrate the throughput. But this was the first furnace. The second one, a rather more refined object, was built in Texas in November 2023. And this was used as part of the Fire Arts Workshop, which had contributions from the US, Europe, and Latin America. The furnace itself, as you can see, it follows that principle of being smooth top to bottom. It has two fire bars. That's what the muffle sits on. And then it has a grill at the bottom, and underneath the grill, to save finance, I've been using standard bricks below the ash box because it doesn't need that sort of temperature control at that point. And then we were fortunate enough to be asked back in March 2024, and I was able to use the facilities at Relis at Texas A&M to cut some specialist pieces. So instead of having the fire bars, we cut parabolic arches out of the fire bricks, which are incredibly dense. They're not easy to cut at all, but with a water jet cutter, we were able to cut these specialist pieces. And this furnace, I was able to control very neatly. We were also able to do work above 1,000 degrees. So this is quite a temperature above what an assay furnace would normally be expected to work to. And also it was we used it for a set of granulation tests, but we also used it for cupellation tests as well. One of the things that was a key issue about this was the fact that though all of the outside furnace, as you can see, is made using standard industrial pieces that have been appropriated for the project, the muffle itself, the small chamber that sits inside the furnace, they're no longer made in the way that they would have been made in the 1600s. They're made to go in electric furnaces, which are far more easygoing on the structure of the piece. So what I did was went back to Erke to look at what sort of clay he was advising to use. So these are the quotes here. Blue clay that turns white in the fire. This is a very interesting description of a ball clay. And then he also identifies that you take broken earthenware, scorifers or crucibles. So I think what he's using is the waste from the workshop, effectively recycling it, and he's grinding it down as far as possible and then you keep adding as much of this so that the clay is almost unworkable. It's almost lost all of its plasticity. Now, as a ceramicist, I'm aware that there is a clay that exists like this now. Or when I say clay, it's not a natural material, it's a clay body. And it's used to make the elements of a furnace or these boxes that are made to put the fine objects in. So in the 19th century, if you were firing porcelain in a coal kiln, you never put the objects straight in the kiln. You put them inside one of these boxes that are called saggers, that are made out of a very rough clay that is really robust. And there's a little sample of it at the bottom. It's made using ground up fired clay called grog that's mixed with the clay that makes it a very short mixture. It's not very plastic like clay normally, but it's a really good material for being robust in a furnace. And so what I did was ended up making these muffles, and they were made to fit inside the furnace. The one on the left, I ended up using the one on the right, which has this sort of flange and fits in very neatly, as you'll see in the next photo. But the process of making them was itself a whole learning curve. And that's a picture of one of the muffles sitting in the furnace. So it slots in the front of it. You can see there's sort of a bit of a recess. That's where that square flange sits in. And the whole of the area around it when it's working is filled with charcoal. And that's what takes it up to temperature. The thing is sitting in the middle. Now, originally, in the same way as 20th century muffles, I made the muffle blind. There's no immediate connection between the inside of the chamber and the outside of the chamber. And that sorry, there's a couple of images of the furnace and the furnace with the top taken off to show where it sits inside the furnace. But that meant there were some problems in terms of managing the fire. Getting the heat into the muffle again after you've opened the front of it took quite a while, and that had an effect on anything that you're working with. If you're working with a cupellation, what happens is the mixture freezes. It's called freezing. The reaction stops taking place, and that's extremely problematic. It's also problematic for any other very temperamental process that you're working with. Going back to the sources, what you find is that the muffles in the 1600s or 16th century have vents in them. So instead of it just being a radiation process, what you've got is convection processes of the heat is going in through these vents. And what I also then found is what happens when you open the front of the furnace in order to charge it is that provides a blast of oxygen to the charcoal that is sitting just outside the muffle that suddenly supercharges the charcoal in there and causes the furnace to sort of push up all of a sudden. So after you've opened the furnace and charged it, you see the temperature actually rise rather than fall. It's got a very temperamental and quite an interesting process that involves a manual understanding of what's happening in the furnace rather than just being able to switch the thing on or off. So this is an image from Dura Metallica showing designs for furnaces. Eka goes, oh, sorry, um, I'm out of line for a second. I'll talk about this. So this is where I started introducing these vents in the side of the muffle. This is one that we actually used, trying some different designs to see what would work the best. And this is something that was also happening in the 1600s because Eka has this image in the treatise showing different types of muffles that have been used by different assayers. So A is the one that used to be used, as he describes, and is still used by the public assayer. I think there's sort of an issue about continued practice that he's kicking against here, or the idea about conservative practice. B is the one that's used in the Nuremberg furnace that there's developed, but he actually advocates the ones that are C that have these notches at the bottom. Instead of having lots of little holes in the side, he's lowering um, the the vents in the side of the mussel, so that actually instead of being holes, they're actually sort of notches at the bottom of the walls. And there's also archaeological evidence, it's very rare, but this is from the um, assay laboratory that was found in Austria. They found a couple of muffles, and these are actually made by uh, cutting a pot in half and then cutting lots of little holes in the side of it. So this gives you an idea about what these things actually look like. They're not quite as perfect as the ones that you see in the imagery, but they've obviously been functional. And at the front, you can see there's some bone ash cupels that were also found in the waste as well. So this is an indication that cupellation is being practiced in this alchemical laboratory alongside distillation processes. There are vessels that connect to both types of processes that are here. Um, Now, what I did find, going back to these sources, is as well as having the vents, and I'll flip back to show, it suddenly became apparent none of these muffles had a base. They're open at the base, and the same happens with this. And I was intrigued about what effect this would actually have. It becomes apparent that instead of having a closed ceramic vessel effectively, what is happening in the 16th century is they're using a metal plate underneath the muffle. And uh, Agricola mentions this, but he also, and I think this is an indication of how important this is, one of the three illustrations he has about assaying, and the only one with any technical information, describes what this plate looks like. It's a metal square and it's got these vents cut in the outside of it. The muffle sits in the middle of this. And so what happens is as the charcoal drops around the outside, it's held in place on the edge of the muffle. But as it turns to ash, the ash can drop down through the holes. So this object is very different from furnaces that come later. And if you look at, once you know that this is happening, if you look at furnaces from different periods, what you see, this is from the uh, 1720s on the left, there's that cutaway. You can see there's no grill at the bottom. There are no fire bars at the bottom. It's just this platform that the muffle sits on that's being held in place by two rods. But by 1780, what we're seeing is you've got both of them. You've got this bar with the two rods that's got shorter. The muffle is a larger percentage, and then underneath what you've got is this grill. So the furnace is actually changing the way it operates over the period of time. And I've done a couple of tests using a metal plate, and gosh, it's really reactive. Because you've got a metal plate, it conducts heat into the muffle space. So as well as having the radiation coming through the muffle and the convection of um, the heated air, you've also got the conduction coming through from the charcoal, which is touching the metal, and it can then conduct heat straight into the bottom. This is even more useful because if you put an object in which has quite a lot of mass, if you've got a ceramic base, you can get a cold spot underneath. But with one of these metal plates, what you've got is conduction that's pulling the cold, pulling heat in a very effective manner. So just to show here, this is um, a cupellation that was taking place. So you can see the reason that there's a little cutaway at the top of the brick that goes in the front of the furnace is to allow a flow of air over the top of the cupel, which is necessary for the process. There needs to be some oxygen in the process when you're using a cupellation. But this is the block, so this is the whole thing full of charcoal blazing, and the temperature in there is about 900 degrees now. Um, and oh, there you go. There's the thing slightly more specifically. You can actually watch the process happening in front of you in terms of seeing the uh, lead, the fumes of lead coming up from the piece. It shouldn't actually do that. It was a bit too overactive, but you can see these processes taking place inside the furnace right in front of you. The engagement of it is quite amazing. And this is always the rather spectacular moment when you take the cupel out, and it's now sitting in a little brick enclosure to so it doesn't cool down too quickly. What you see is this bead of beautifully shiny precious metal with the last heat. Obviously the part of the cupel that is saturated with lead is retaining its heat a bit more. That's why you've got the red glow around it. But the reason I want to flag this particularly is back in 2009 when I was doing my training, you'd go through this process in a very scientific manner of measuring, and you fold the whole thing up. But when you open up the furnace afterwards and you see this bead of bright gold, the idea of transformation is amazing. You know, what has gone in there is a lump of it's folded up in a piece of lead. You've got this really dark material. What you get out is suddenly this beautiful object. Um, you then there's a second process called parting, which separates the silver. It basically you use acid to eat the silver away, and you're left with this pure gold object, which is even more spectacular as the end of it. But thinking about it in terms of a physical transformation, that anybody undertaking this process experiences this. It's quite fascinating, but it's probably more visceral when you see it happening inside a charcoal furnace than it is inside an electric one. So that's the picture of one of the furnaces in operation with a. I'm not sure there's any sartorial elegance in the operator, but let's skip past that aspect. It's the fact that operating the thing, it always operated. It took about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours to get the furnace operating at its peak efficiency, and then it had a sweet period of about 2, 3 hours when it would operate perfectly, and then it would start to deteriorate as it clogged. So this is an indication about the fact that these furnaces have a limitation in terms of how much work you can do with them, but also about the fact that for quite a period of time they are operating really well. But you sort of become it has these demands on you. It's not like a modern process that you choose when to start it. You've actually got to commit a long period of time and be the servant of the furnace while it's happening. You can't leave it for any period of time without concentrating. Otherwise, it will go off the boil and it takes a long time to get it back to temperature. So this sort of idea that you see in some of the texts about um, needing to manage the furnace, needing to stay with the furnace, and needing to nurture it is you see the same thing happening when we're doing this. Oh, sorry, that's better. Um, it was also interesting being able to do, obviously, this is a very modern approach, but seeing how different parts of the furnace were in terms of operation, talking about any furnace having a temperature, I think is a very simplistic element of it. It had cold spots and hot spots even inside the different parts of the chamber. The muffle was always at a different temperature to the rest of the charcoal, the fire chamber that it operated in. And I've dropped this photo in because at the same time as doing the furnace work, I've been doing work with kiln firings. This is a very particular kiln called a fast fire kiln that has been developed by Claude, the guy on the left. He's a professional kiln builder, and it was very interesting seeing how this operated and how that relates to how the furnace operates. That in some sense, the furnace is like an updraft kiln. Um, but the idea about how the heat transfers across the chambers, it was sort of a revelation, and also about the way the bricks affect they hold heat, or they will the insulating bricks, that's the white ones that you can see at the front there, just won't let heat through at all. And the last thing is about, which I've become increasingly interested in, is about the charcoal, because the fuel itself is far more variable than you'd expect. We were fortunate enough to be able to use the mesquite when we were at in Texas, which of course is a really dense wood that fires particularly well, and was I think, part of the reason it was successful. Um, Firing in the UK, I'm using different types of wood, and I've now got on to making my own. These things are never ending, aren't they? But it's quite fascinating how different woods act in different ways when you're firing. And it sort of opens up a whole new question about where are people getting this material from. Of course, it connects to an issue of sustainability, which I've been interested in terms of this type of material for a long time, about the need for charcoal decimating woodlands in the UK and across Europe during this period of time. But that's probably a conversation for another time. Um, I just finished with the flag that we've got the articles up, and there are certainly others more magnificent there than mine, but it's there if you want to see it. And also on the RCA website, there is a more of a photo essay about the process, and some descriptions about the background and the outputs. So if you want to chase that up, it's easy to find either my staff page, or if you put charcoal fire assaying Royal College of Art into Google, it will find it straight away. So that's the end of the presentation for me. I hope it's given you some idea about what we've been working on, what I've been working on, but also I hope that it sort of gives an idea about alchemical practices from a much more embodied process than is quite often talked about. I think these notions about nurturing the fire, once you've been doing it for a day, you realize what it actually entails. And this idea of commitment that you keep reading about in alchemical texts, I think it's seeing that, or feeling it through the work, is quite a fascinating thing. Also, the skill set that people must have had for fire management during this period of time, that is alluded to, and indeed says it's difficult to explain. It's hard to learn. There's not a lot I can say about this. And basically, anybody who hasn't got the skills, you're stuck. Um, it's an interesting element that, for all the information that we do get, there's certainly a lot of expertise that is missing in manuscripts and in illustrations, that we have to understand is there, but just isn't spoken about. And that's sort of me finished. So over to you, Joe, to do some managing.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. That was very interesting, and it's yeah, it's quite impressive how these things go over time. You know, it's like they change, but the basic thing still stays the same. I mean, the whole, you know, the structure itself, the way it's taught, and it's I think that's very yeah, somehow it captures your imagination. And, but yeah, I mean, my question was regarding the chimeric aspect. I mean, because I liked that term, and I was like thinking, you know, kind of chimeras floating about or something. You know, it just sounds really cool. If you can
Um,
explain it a bit more.
yeah, certainly. So thinking about the furnace itself, I mean, I go into some of this more about in the paper, but it's a mixture of practicalities of experimentation, um, but also a consideration about can you really ever construct a perfect replica of a furnace from any period? I've been going through, if you think about that you're creating an iron furnace, what iron is it made of? Finding out that the bricks, the different bricks that were being used, and this is where Claude was such a help in terms of of discussing with him about the finesses of particular types of bricks or linings for furnaces, that these things have a huge effect on what you're creating. So even if you choose something that you think is as close as possible, there may be all sorts of things that are happening that the modern, for want of a better word, or contemporary materials are actually affecting the process in a way that you'd never really understand because you never get the opportunity to see what happens without them unless you really go to that sense. So I'm kind of leaning into this and saying, no, you can't make something that's perfectly a perfect replica. And therefore, what we're doing is acknowledging that what we've got is always going to be a sort of bastardized version, for want of a better word. It will always be influenced by the contemporary environment of the materials that you use, how you get hold of them, and to some extent also your attitude towards these things as well. Um, so that's the idea about the fact of, well, it actually it gives a lot more freedom in terms of making and experimenting. And the question that I sort of pose myself is, if I tried to construct one of the furnaces that Erka describes as accurately as possible, is that going to lock me into an expectation that I can't make any changes? And also, there's a fact that was the furnace that he was using was every furnace of that period of time exactly the same? I would say not. Some were probably badly made, some were more hurriedly made. There is one extant furnace that's very highly decorated in that was supposed to belong to the Saxony, the sovereign of Saxony. So is that the one that you take as the example, or is actually that probably not a very good furnace in operation, but it looked spectacular because it was meant as a symbolic representation? So I think that's one of the things, having the chimeric aspect allows you to do that, but it also allows you to change things in and out of it, change elements in the furnace without feeling guilty about it. There is no platonic reference that you've got of what is the ideal furnace that you are trying to aspire to. It's like a sort of fuzzy logic of, there's a type of furnace and let's see what this does, which is a much more realistic way of doing it. Or I feel it, from the point of view of having done it, it was achievable. Looking back, I think it would have taken about 3 or 4 years to build one furnace that was like Erka's. And if I'd got it wrong, then what would you have done? You'd have to start from scratch again. So in terms of a learning process, having this more modular construction that incorporates different elements possibly is a better learning experience, thinking of it as an experimental approach. Alex has been
Thank you for
patiently
that.
waiting.
Yeah, please, Alex, can you ask your questions?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes.
Well, wonderful talk. I enjoyed it very much, Peter. I have a practical question. So you have to mix gold with the lead.
Yeah.
Now, the melting points of these two materials are quite different. So
Mhm.
how do you pre-treat the material before you actually put it in the oven? I mean, do you have to grind it up? Because you probably want to avoid the lead to melt before it actually can absorb all the gold.
So what happens is, you have your sample of material which contains gold and silver, or usually gold and silver, and may contain other materials as well. So it may have, copper, nickel, all sorts of things in there. You wrap it in lead foil.
Mhm.
So the material that goes into the furnace is actually all the metals, just as solid materials. And the lead immediately or very quickly melts when it's in the furnace. And where you've got the oxygen going over, it turns into lead oxide, litharge, and that melts And that has a very low surface tension. That's why it's able to go into the porous body of the cupel, and it drags all of the base metals in. The gold and silver will not alloy with the lead. This is one of the things about the material. Now, a very small percentage does actually get drawn in, and this is one of the, if you're talking about the standard errors that occur in the process, it's understood that there's a very small percentage loss, but it's incredibly small, and it's actually it can be mitigated against by good practice when you're doing it, by not cupellating for too long, by not having the temperature go too high. So, there's an art to this in terms of keeping the furnace at exactly the right temperature. And the 19th century books describe, 19th and early 20th century books, describe visually watching the furnace and what happens at each stage of the cupellation to ensure that you're doing it correctly. It actually sort of grows these tiny fronds of material, which are called feathers, during the process. It's actually quite an elegant process in all sorts of ways. Of course, this is happening in every cupellation that takes place in the late 20th century, but nobody ever sees it because the door's shut and that's it. So these visual clues that the assayer looks for are what happens. But it's about the inherent, to become very moralistic about it, the nobility of the metals, that they do not mix with the base metals, which is what is behind the process. Yeah, so they mix, all of the base metals get sucked into the body of the furnace, and what you get left with is a clean base to the cupel with just this bead of precious metal that's left in the bottom of the furnace.
Yeah, but presumably you have to grind up the gold before, so you have higher surface area in order to get the impurities out.
Yeah. Your samples are not very large, and because you've got an alloy in there, it all melts. There are some odd processes that take place during during cupellation. One of them is about the fact that the bead of material actually, because of exothermic reactions, gets hotter than the furnaces. So though the furnace is operating at the end of the cupellation, you try and get it to 920, but actually the bead itself is hotter than the furnace around the furnace around it, and you see this, that it starts to glow particularly brightly, and this sort of flash is one of the things that is described as, that the cupellation's working if you've got this. But if it, as you're exactly right, if it stayed at, if everything in the furnace was in the low 900s, you wouldn't get you wouldn't get the process work. But it's about this whole set of things that happen as the lead starts to go into it, the alloy ratios change, and that causes a reaction to take place in the bead itself. It also has a surface, the surface of it starts to move, and it looks like basically like an oil film, the movement, and it looks as if the bead is actually turning over, which is remarkable considering it's not doing anything like that at all. It gets
Yeah, I've seen videos of that, so it's very, very
yeah.
striking.
But yeah, it's amazing, all these things that are happening in this process, about how how it does these things that make it look very much alive. You could imbue it with all sorts of properties, because it's not doing what you'd really expect. It doesn't just sit there and melt in a lump. It does some quite amazing things. But yeah, the localized exothermic reaction is what takes it up to the temperature that you need for the melting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, Carmen has her hand up next. So, Carmen.
Oh, sorry, Carmen, you're on
You
mute.
need to turn your audio on.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Peter, for this fascinating lecture coming right out of the practice. I have a question about the time that that one would have needed to get such a furnace hot enough to be able to perform the operation. And could you tell us something on whether the time has possibly shortened with time in over the centuries in connection perhaps with an improvement of the technology?
I think, yeah, it's an interesting one because we immediately think, is it an improvement of the technology? Um, the
Not.
the furnace I was using, it took an hour and a half, and it was consistently always an hour and a half until I changed a couple of elements inside the furnace slightly, and then it would take an hour and a quarter. And it was reliably, the issue was if the wood was damp, it would take longer to catch in the first place. So, doing it on a damp day was noticeably different from doing it on a dry day. Doing it on a windy day was wonderful. We had the wind in exactly the right direction on the last day, and the thing took like that. So I think those aspects are critical in terms of operating where you've put the furnace as well as what the furnace itself is like. But if
Thank
you
you.
read the 19th century textbooks, they're saying it will take an hour and a half to get the thing ready. You need to have basically the junior member of the assay office has to go in and set the furnaces. And for me, there's an odd thing that the first job I had when I left school, I worked in a chemical company, and I had to be there at 8:30 to start the boiler and test the boiler water. Everybody else was on variable. You could come in at any time you like, I got told, but you'll have to be here at 8:30 to do the boiler tests. And I think it's that same thing throughout history. There's been somebody having to go in early to set things. Obviously, it's not quite the same now. But that aspect, I think, like any steam engine or any solid fuel system, there needs to be probably an hour and a half that you have to give it. It won't operate without that. But the assay office furnaces that are in the textbooks from the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, are working almost continually. They actually don't need to be shut down because they can be cleaned out while they're operating. So they are quite a different creature. And this is really talking about improvements. What it is it's a difference of design to allow a much larger use of the furnace in terms of continually use rather than the more batch production type approach of the older assay furnace. I mean, I have a quote in the paper about the fact that ERCA is talking about an assay office that is so busy that it has over 200 assays a week that it manages. And then in one of the 1930 book from the 1930s, at the back, it's got the equipment for running a small assay office. And it says this type of assay office will conduct between 30 and 40 assays a day. So what is seen as the most exceptionally large assay office in Christendom, as far as ERCA is concerned, is sort of the smallest type of assay office you're talking about for the 1920s and 30s. I think that indication of the number of assays that goes up over this period of time is sort of the indication about the demands that get placed on the assay office with the advent of scientific practice and duplicate tests, and also having standardized tests. These sort of things have an impact on how you operate your furnace. So it sort of becomes a response to those external demands that change the design of the furnace. And you can call them better if those are the things that you want, and your furnace then responds to that. Yes, it is better. But it's always a case of, at the same time, you've lost other things with the furnace. You've lost the response that you get with this, with one of these 16th century furnaces with the metal plate in that will respond immediately, or much more. It's much more responsive than the later ones are that require the time. So something's gained and something's lost each time you make the change to the design, I think. Does that answer the question? Is that a... Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, and the last question from Thijs.
Thanks, Peter, for a very interesting talk. So I have a question, but also I'm lucky enough to have the Wegwijzer, so the on my desk, so I could actually fact check a couple of things, Peter.
Brilliant. Now, am I supposed to be worried or excited?
Sorry, yeah, no, it's actually very interesting. But it has a very small. I knew there's a very small chapter on muffles, and here it says that you need to prepare slabs of clay. You need to cut it into rectangular pieces so it can serve as a bottom to the muffle.
Yeah.
So it might actually be very interesting for you to take a look at it. And also it has some recipes for the kind of clay that you need. So pipe clay, for instance, potter's clay, and mixed up with, it says, sand in order to take away the fattiness. So, I mean, very, very, very much in agreement with what you said.
I think it is an interesting point that you also see in Aircare that there are clay bases. So presumably they are interchangeable, that you can use the clay one or you can use the metal one. And actually, I'll tell you now, trying to cut one of those metal plates is not an easy business. It would be much easier it would have been easier for me to roll out a slab of clay and do it, but I desperately wanted to see what one of them was like. And it's the fact that it's made out of iron that makes the difference effectively. But of course, thinking about it, it must have been a much more expensive piece of equipment to have. And this is the same thing that, are you working with the cheapest test tubes, or do you have your Pyrex type? It occurs in a lot of laboratory. Do you have your Hessian crucible that's got the graphite in and is resilient to shocks, or are you using something that's been put together by your local potter which will kind of survive but not do well? It happens again and again in these laboratories, isn't it? This is exactly this thing that everybody is operating with a whole different level of, some people have got spectacular equipment, some people have got rather dodgy whatever they can put together. And of course this is Boyle's, with the Leviathan, the fact that it was very difficult to buy the equipment for the air pump. It was exceptionally expensive, and getting the thing to work properly was so difficult. So it's not unique to this period of time. But yeah, it's a really interesting point that you've got that, the fact that they're saying 150 years later, they're moving to this ceramic plate.
Yeah.
It's basically sort of closing the thing up gradually, starts happening. But the fattiness, I love that, because it's a really good description of plastic clay, is this sort of fattiness, but it's also slightly repulsive as well, this idea of it being greasy. And
I will get you the text. We can go over it, meet you soon.
Yeah.
But I have another question. This is my actual question, basically. So, well, I've looked into furnaces, enameling furnaces as well, and what you see is that there is certain professions, well, or at least the professionalization in the way that these furnaces are being made. So there's specialized groups of people who you can go to for these kind of furnaces, but it's very, very difficult to trace them. Did you find anyone or any indication of professional furnace builders? And especially, I mean, because you took a deep dive into quite a large period of time, is there some sort of a development that you came across?
Oh yeah. So I mean, even just inside the text with Erke, there is the mention when he talks about the iron furnace. What he says is the iron furnace, as made with the iron that's used for armor. So you've immediately got a connection to a very specific profession that is evident in the 1600s. There's sort of similarities to when cars were first made, that there were panel beaters who would make each part of the car element by hand. And of course, that skill with pressing using large scale presses went out of the window. It was so much cheaper to transport it from one place to another than it is to have these things made by hand. But it's the fact that the armory skills, I think, again, looking at those furnaces with the curved tops, that relates to armory skills. And having done blacksmithing work, getting those sort of things consistent and getting the joins to connect is quite a skill. Remember, this thing is not being welded using a welding. It's got to fit properly using rivets or bolts. So there's a whole aspect there. And Urquhart actually excuses it. He expects his assayers to be proficient in all sorts of making processes, including mixing up the material that goes inside the steel furnace. He expects people to be able to make their own cupels and make their own. The one thing he excuses them from is making large pieces of metal. This is explicitly identified as no, you don't have to do that. And that, I think, is also an indication of just how difficult it was to do. But he keeps on saying assays should be self-sufficient. You should be able to make everything because you won't be able to rely on everyone all the time. By the 19th century, reliance is standard. The books all have adverts for everything that you need. And for things that don't travel, like the cupels at this point are being made out of bone ash, which doesn't travel particularly well. It's quite friable. So what you can do is buy yourself a cupel making machine, a cupel press, to ensure that all your cupels are the same as the other assayers that you've trained with and that are working in other assay offices. There's an international standardization going on at one remove by selling these products. And that aspect of it, the idea that it's part of a much larger network, and that though somebody may be working in the north slope of the Nome slope of Alaska, or in the 1860s, 1870s, the cupels that are being made are coming from the UK. They're coming from a factory in London, in Battersea, and they're being shipped around the world. It's particularly connected to the British Empire. So this idea about colonialism, you see them in Australia, you find them in New Zealand, and this company is basically shipping these things around the world. It's an amazing network of control, but also of standardization. And the American suppliers are saying, actually, you can buy cupels or you can buy crucibles in America that are just as good as the ones that are made by Morgan. So this is the idea about the bench, this benchmark that's there, that the company is named as you can actually buy ones in America. So the Denver Fire Assay Company, which is becomes an enormous player in the US during the gold rush, is still competing with materials being shipped from the other side of the Atlantic. It's quite fascinating, and in much the same way as in the 16th century, people are talking about the Hessian crucibles being without par, and if you want to get them from Hess because they'll last so much better, you see this sort of expertise and this distribution networks are appearing in the 16th century, but they really come into place in the 20th. The adverts are fascinating, to be honest. That again, there's a whole thing in your own right that there must be networks here. How do you get your advert into the books? What sort of mentions are made, but the fact that these specific companies, and that's actually that sort of to finish it, that the picture of Brown's furnace, he's writing the textbook, he's also designed that furnace, and he is selling that furnace in the in the book. So you no longer have to build your own furnace, you can get it shipped in.
Mhm.
So it's there's a real shift with that.
Yeah, I'm sorry I have to interrupt this very interesting discussion. And I mean, it seems like it, yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects that can be discussed about this and all these kind of facets to the subject. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for this great and very enthusiastic presentation. I mean, you know so much about this. So it's very nice always to hear from you. So presenting. Um, but yeah, thank you again, everyone, for participating. I would emphasize that the next one, it's in 2 weeks' time. So not next week, but in 2 weeks' time. And it's I'm gonna invite myself, host myself, with Peter Pavlas and Wojtek Kaszy, who will be talking about the early modern Latin alchemical print corpus that we compiled as part of the Czech project called Tome. So basically, we'll be jumping from reconstruction to computation, but we know we like that very much. So we're big fans of mixing and matching that kind of thing. Again, thank you everyone for coming, and have a great weekend and a week ahead. And thank you, Peter, again. So it was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone, and thanks for the great
Thank
question.
you.
Thank you,
Bye
Joe.
bye.